Sorry, Kerry.
You were quicker than I thought you would.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, we're just mindful that we don't want to hold you up from your next event. Okay, so I mentioned before that we do have the official referendum booklet out now, and we kind of changed tack a little bit, and I'll be presenting some of the arguments of the no case to Kerry and asking for his comment. So the first one, and most of this is pretty much verbatim out of the book. So Kerry, the Voice presents a real risk to our system of government. The Voice specifically covers all areas of executive government. This means that no issue is beyond its reach.
Well, I mean, Indigenous...
Okay, let's move.
Indigenous people who, through generations, and the people who have emerged as leaders, that sort of the Pat Dodson and Marcia Langdon band, and then the leaders who've come up, and Lois O'Donoghue, and the people who've then come up behind them, like the Noel Pearsons and others. These are all frivolous people, as you know. They really are, you know, and the people who will be elected by Indigenous communities who for generations have been crying out for a voice, who've been crying out to be heard, they're going to engage in paperclip issues, aren't they? It's insulting, it really is. That they're going to be concerned about where our nuclear submarines are going to be based when they arrive here in 2096. So that's, and it's a kind of surface illustration of a deeper problem, and that is there's this ripple of belief that surfaces here and there. And I've heard people ask me, and I've seen it happening, where somehow or other Indigenous people are less trustworthy than the rest of us. They are more likely to abuse power if they have it. They are more likely to have governance issues if they're handed money. I mean, our Parliament is an exemplary manifestation of good governance, isn't it? No pork barrelling there. I think, frankly, that we are at a low in this country's political history in terms of those kinds of integrity issues. So, you know, the idea, there's an argument that executive government shouldn't be a part of the Voice. The Voice should not have the opportunity to go to executive government. Where do you think policy starts? Policy starts in the Parliament. So if it's the Health Department, whether it's as a result of public pressure, whether it's a result of the states complaining to the Commonwealth that a particular health policy is not working, in the Health Department there are people who are engaged in policy processes. They're the experts, they're the policy experts. And they might have outside input too from universities and so on, the experts around the country. That policy then is discussed with the Minister and at the senior levels, and eventually a policy draft is formulated. When it gets to a point where the Minister believes that there is a real policy that to be countenanced, it's written and it goes to the Cabinet. The Cabinet determines it in consultation with the party, with the backbench party room. It then goes out into the Parliament. Through both houses, lower and upper, they have intense discussions. Some policies are more obvious than others and less contentious. They go through in extensive committee processes. And we know what the Senate is like these days. I mean, at times it can look like a total mishmash, but at other times you actually see some surprising individual senators contributing common sense solutions to policy issues, and what comes out is better than it was going in. Bottom line is, it's the democratic process, and to actually suggest that we're going to give Indigenous people this right, but we're going to curtail half the process, which just happens to be the first half of the process, and they only get a look in at the end. It's just insulting again. So of course it has to be that. They're not going to clog up the courts with specious issues. They're just not. And as High Court judges and former High Court judges, I've spoken a lot to Kenneth Hayne, very respected former High Court judge, appointed by a Conservative government, and then appointed by another Conservative government to head up the Royal Commission into banks and financial institutions. Very credible this guy. He backs it to the hill. He backs the voice to the hill. He says it's absolute rubbish that this might happen. And he said, but anyway, the bloody courts, he didn't say bloody, I will. The bloody courts are a fundamental pillar of our democracy as well. They're there as a check and a balance. That's their job, that's what they do. And you'd only need one test case, or possibly two test cases on one or other aspect of this. That'll be the end of it. So the stuff about how government is going to be brought to a grinding halt if Aboriginal people are allowed to make representations to executive government, and the second one, that the High Courts are going to be clogged with specious cases. Though these are totally dismissed by the experts.
So, another argument in the no case regards the lack of detail. So, Kerry, no details have been provided on how members of the Voice would be chosen and on how it would operate.
Yeah.
Your comments?
Yeah.
Well, I did touch on it earlier that you have two parts to this process. The Constitution, I hadn't intended to bring my copy of the Constitution along today, and it's in my other coat. That's the point of it. It slips nicely into your inside coat pocket, if you might. And so it's a very small document, the size of a passport. It is a set of guiding principles. It's the framework about the rules that that our country is governed by. If, when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, which incidentally had to be passed by the British Parliament before it could be implemented, but that's the next referendum, it was written in virtually dot point form for a very good reason. Because if they had been expected to provide detail, to write detail into the process, we'd never have had a constitution. We would never have got there. One illustration that's offered by another former High Court Chief Justice, who also supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart, including enshrining the voice in the Constitution, is Murray Gleeson. And Murray Gleeson himself gives this example. The High Court was written into the Constitution. That is the principle of a peak body High Court, which is the ultimate court of the land. It took 2 years for the Parliament to determine what the High Court would look like. So extrapolate that out and imagine how long it took. I mean, tax policy is still being rewritten all the time. So the reference to tax policy is like about, a few lines. But the Commonwealth Government will have the power to collect tax. If you look at the tax law that has been written since then, it would stand about that high. So the idea that with a voice, there again, you see, Indigenous people, we've got to make an exception for Indigenous people because they might do something that would be risky. So the principle again, simple. That there would be that we recognise the First Nations people and their 65,000 plus continuous civilisation. And my God, there's a whole other sort of significance behind that. What it took, the skills base it took for people to survive and prosper through 65,000 years across the Australian landscape, right? And act as responsible custodians for it and develop their own laws, literally their own laws. The Mabo case established the existence of Indigenous common law sitting alongside our Australian common law inherited from Britain. And now I've lost the thread. So where was I going, Kathy? It was...
Detail.
The detail. So in here, the referendum working group made up of Indigenous Australians who were advising the government on the form of words that was acceptable to them on behalf of Indigenous people, which was then taken to Cabinet and passed, and ultimately passed in the Parliament. There's a set of guiding principles, and I'll just read again the headings on each of those, which and then I'll ask you what more you need. The design principles. The voice will give independent advice to the Parliament and Government, and that's important, independent advice, because even ATSIC was responsible to the Minister. It will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people based on the wishes of local communities. So the stuff I saw reflected in one of the questions I think that you had, Kathy, someone was asking how effective will the voice be if the individuals who make up the voice are chosen by government. There is no way, shape or form in which any government, or the government that actually has the job of putting the voice together in the first place, can take that independence away. So that's another important principle. Another one will be representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, gender balanced, and include youth. In other words, it will be democratic. It will be empowering, community-led. It will be empowering, community-led, inclusive, respectful, and culturally informed. By God, that sounds a threat. It will be accountable and transparent. But Indigenous people aren't capable of being accountable and transparent. It will work alongside existing organisations and traditional structures. It will not have a program delivery function. It will not have a veto power. So, as a set of guiding principles for what we can expect the voice to actually look like in the end, are you really thinking that you need to know, before you decide whether you're going to vote yes or no, whether there will be 24 Indigenous people making up the voice, as has been proposed by the Langton Karma review on behalf of the previous government? Do you think it'll matter whether it's 24 or 26 or 28 or 42 or even 50? Is that going to matter to you in determining a principle for our Constitution? I don't think so.
Okay. There's a risk that enshrining a voice in the Constitution for only one group of Australians will permanently divide our country.
Our country is already divided. And our country has been divided since that flag was first planted by Arthur Phillip. And I've seen the divisions. The divisions are there and the divisions are real. So, can we think of another group that we think should be enshrined in the Constitution for a particular reason that might match the reasons we're dealing with here? The first occupants of this land, who ran it and looked after it and thrived in it for 65,000 plus years, who have become, since white colonisation, the most marginalised community on the continent and its surrounding islands, who have been thoroughly dispossessed with some small moments where some of that dispossession has begun to be addressed, like, for example, through native title. And even native title, it went through its first stage, and then along came the Whig judgment, which caused a flutter, and John Howard was Prime Minister by then, and he came up with a plan that essentially weakened the process. So these things are never guaranteed in their permanence. But the fundamental argument to me is this does not create two Australias. It is simply acknowledging a prior presence that was important. It's acknowledging that giant contribution that gave us our start. It is implicitly acknowledging the injustices that have followed since. And it is saying that we want to redress that wrong, that profound wrong in our nation. Whatever other problems we have, this is profound. It is addressable. We believe that permanence is required. It's not going to be abused because the transparency will be there, the power is limited, the Parliament retains the full authority that is vested in it in our democracy on so many other things. The Parliament retains its superiority in terms of law. So what exactly is it about this that's going to create two Australias? Because that is what John Howard reflected back in 1988 over ATSIC. Did we get two Australias there? No, we did not. We certainly didn't get a kind of rising black power that threatened us all. And with Mabo, we didn't lose our backyards, our suburban backyards, as was suggested by its opponents. And when the Whig judgment was made, the pastoralists didn't lose their farms the way that was proposed. I mean, we should know these scare tactics back to front. And you could have gone out when Anthony Albanese announced on election night that he was making that commitment to facilitate the Uluru Statement from the Heart process with regard to voice. If you'd wanted to know how this campaign was going to evolve, all you had to do, certainly in terms of its opposition, all you had to do was go and look at the template that emerged around the Republican debate in 1999. Even to the point of the slogan, if you don't know, vote no. To me, there's not just a moral bankruptcy here, and I'm not including all people who are opposed. I think there are people who have valid questions and valid concerns. But there is an intellectual bankruptcy that is driving the main opponents of this, and you've got to wonder why. And
that's a good segue to looking at some of the people who are supporting the no case. And so we've got a number of questions asking for you to comment on the reality that there are some Aboriginal people who are supporting the no case.
Yeah, and there's a range of them. There is a range of them, and there are those who say it goes too far and it's too risky, or it's not going to be effective, and that's the kind of Jacinta Price thing. And then there are those who say it doesn't go far enough. There are those who say it's going to affect sovereignty, or they say we need treaty first. And so those who are coming from Indigenous people, you start from a basis of respect. You at least give them the time to contemplate what they're saying and where it's coming from. But do it in this context. There have been, to my knowledge, 4 polls done specifically within Indigenous communities to get their opinion. Now, to the extent that we can trust opinion polls at all, you've got some chance of getting a more accurate picture if you have a multiplicity of polls or you see a trend line. So there have been 4 polls, to my knowledge, that have been done, reputable polls done. And in every case, the end picture is a resounding support for yes, that ranges between 80% and 88%. So, of course, the people who don't like that say, oh, well, they're small samples. Well, actually, one of them was 850 people, 850 Indigenous people, out of a population of 800,000. Compared with a sample size, and I saw a sample size on a poll not that long ago related to political issues, I can't remember what, where the sample size was something like 1,250, or you might see 2,000 people. So if you're talking proportionately, it's a bigger poll than a lot of these other polls that get regularly aired in the media. I would not deny the trend. The bigger trend in the polls, not these ones related to Indigenous perspectives, but the bigger polls which are clearly showing a trend away from yes. And there are reasons for that too that I'll go into if you want, but I think that's a sort of secondary thing. Bottom line, somewhere between 80 and 88% of Indigenous people support this. So, treaty first. Treaties are already in train in Victoria. They've been working on that process now for a decade. They've got legislation, they've got a body that's beginning the process of treaty negotiation. In Queensland, I was part of an advisory committee with the Queensland government, setting up some suggested ground rules for a pathway to treaty. What has happened since then, that was about 3 years ago, what's happened since then is that it's now passed into legislation in Queensland, where there is a treaty process now underway, and truth-telling. And it was with bipartisan support in Peter Dutton's home state. Bipartisan support, barely a ripple in the Murdoch media. So, and Northern Territory, South Australia and Tasmania, treaty processes underway. Treaties take forever. Treaties, modern treaties of this kind take decades, can take decades. There is nothing about having a voice that is going to slow that process around the states, and most of these treaties will happen with the states. I suspect that what might ultimately emerge at the national level is maybe one kind of umbrella treaty which expresses some very specific important things, but that those kind of nut and bolt treaties between particular Indigenous nations and state governments, going to take a long time. There is nothing about this that's going to slow that process, except that nationally the voice gets embedded, it starts working. I think what you'll then see is, and there's certainly an Albanese government which is committed to a Makarrata commission, that it will then start that other process, which of course will run it'll run through the federal parliament in the same way, it'll take time. And for those who want to try and create fears and confusion with the public about what a treaty represents, a treaty can't happen unless the two or more sides of that treaty agree on it. So it will take parliaments, our representatives around the states and the Commonwealth, it will take parliaments to agree to sign those treaties, for the government to sign those treaties, that would, in whatever form, come into force. There'll be national discussions about them, or discussions in the various states. What the hell is there to fear about these things? So there's treaty and sovereignty. Lydia Thorpe threw the cat among the pigeons very early in the process when she declared very dramatically that she was not going to vote for the Voice, and she was the Greens representative on Indigenous stuff at the time. She very rapidly left the Greens. She's now an independent. So there are people who picked up on this. It's going to affect sovereignty. It's going to take our sovereignty. No, it's not. No, it's not. Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded, and there's nothing about this Voice that can in any way tamper with Indigenous sovereignty. And the statement talks of it being a spiritual notion, an important notion. Sovereignty may come into play in particular treaties. It does not come into play on the Voice. There is nothing about the establishment of the Voice as a permanent fixture on our landscape that in any way, shape or form reduces Indigenous sovereignty. And another former Chief Justice of the High Court, Robert French, he's in there, tells you why in legal terms. These things are being dispatched, there's this great sort of avalanche of confusion that's being created around these various claims. You take all of those claims in their turn, and truly, you can hit them to the fence.
Warren Mundine.
Warren Mundine, I'm not in a position to, and I don't want to doubt the sincerity of any individual involved in this, with the possible exception of one person who's not Indigenous. But Warren Mundine started on the Labor side, tried to get pre-selection into Parliament with Labor. He's ended up on the Liberal side, got pre-selection for a seat and wasn't elected to the Parliament. I'm just not sure where Warren Mundine is coming from, but he has been across the political spectrum. And when people say it's another thing, but there are now 11 members, there are now 11 Indigenous members of Parliament. And even if Warren Mundine did get into Parliament, his first responsibility would be to represent the people of his electorate. And the electorate he ran for was a predominantly non-Indigenous electorate. He would also be having to represent the interests of his political party. And somewhere in there you would hope that he and the other Indigenous members of Parliament would have some scope to be some sort of a voice for Indigenous people. But they might be voted out at the next election. Jacinta Price is a Northern Territory Senator. As John Howard himself observed in his autobiography, which is one of my favourite reference books, John Howard wrote in there that most and it was, you had to speculate as to why he thought it was important to say, but it certainly gave you an insight to him. He observed along the way in talking about Indigenous issues that most Indigenous people voted Labor. Now, why does that matter? Why does it matter if one cultural group in our society predominantly votes one way over another? Does that matter? That's their... I would have thought that was the democratic right. Anyway, Jacinta Price is a Conservative senator in the Northern Territory. She is pre-selected by white men, largely. And she does not get elected to the parliament on a majority black vote in the Northern Territory, because even John Howard says the majority of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory vote Labor. So who is Jacinta Price representing? These things get blurred and they're complicated. But you know, and then there's Tony Abbott, and there's Bronwyn Bishop, and there's John Anderson, the former Nationals leader, and then there's John himself, John Howard, who's telling no voters to maintain their rage, which I thought in itself was outrageous for reasons that should be obvious to us all, the word rage around this issue. So, and I think now John Howard and his ministers, including John Anderson and Tony Abbott, Bronwyn Bishop, they had 11.5 years to improve the lot of Indigenous Australians. And then there was Tony Abbott as Prime Minister, and Malcolm Turnbull and Morrison for another 9.5 years. So there's more than 20 years out of the last 26 or 27 where these people who are telling us to vote no on this had their chance to improve the lot of Indigenous Australians, and the story of Indigenous Australians very demonstrably went backwards. And when John Howard sent the troops, having abolished ATSIC, and then subsequently sent the troops in their uniforms into these most marginalised and fearful communities in Australia in the intervention in 2007, and the experts will tell you it caused untold harm. It was supposed to make things better, it caused untold harm. And then at the end of in November 2007, after the Howard government was voted out, and one of John Howard's closest confidants and supporters through those 11.5 years of government went on the Insiders program as part of the post-mortem of the election. And he revealed that they, the government, meaning those people who were most concerned in how do we win the next election, were surprised that they didn't get a bounce in the polls from the intervention. What does that tell you about why the intervention happened? And again, nothing's simple, black and white. Well, some things are, but I'm prepared to give some benefit of the doubt that maybe they thought they were doing the right thing, but they were also very surprised when they didn't get a bounce in the polls.
Okay, we're going to...
So you look to the company you're keeping, I think, if you're going to vote yes or if you're going to vote no.
So we're going to sort of change tack a little bit now to how do we, in a practical way and in an effective way, get behind the yes case. And I'm going to sort of come at this a little bit strangely and just ask, how do we speak? So moving to some media outlets now. How do we speak with people who are influenced by the likes of the Murdoch Press and Ray Hadley?
Interestingly, the Murdoch Press expressed the sentiment around the time that we knew we were going to have a referendum sometime this term. They expressed the view that they would be supportive. I was always sceptical of that, sadly, because their commercial model, the Murdoch commercial model, well known, you know, the biggest illustration of it is in America, but you can see it in Britain and you can certainly see it here too. It's a commercial model based on appealing to one group in the community and dividing in the process. You have to have, you know, good guys and bad, goodies and baddies, friends and enemies. And the goodies and baddies aren't necessarily, you know, in America, Republicans versus Democrats. You can even have good and baddies in the Republican Party, so if you're anti-Trump, you're a baddie in the Republicans. That's the model. And in America, there's enough of a population that if you've got 10 million disaffected people on that conservative side, and they might just be people who themselves feel that they've been marginalised, that they've been let down by the status quo in Washington or whatever, but they become fodder for the commercial model, which has become the success story for the Murdoch media. And we are a reflection, or a smaller reflection of that same syndrome here. But to directly address your question, Kathy, I think that and one strong reason that I'm here today to talk to you is because I have concern about what the churches, what the religious denominations are really doing to back up their claims that they support the Uluru Statement. and I'm finding it hard to get a gauge of that. I'm keen to hear how much of what we've talked about today is being discussed in perhaps a more appropriate form from the pulpit. How much activity is being led by the church in its various parishes and dioceses? And I actually looked out the words of the Bishops' Conference where it gave its endorsement to the Uluru Statement, and frankly I saw enough weasel words in there to let you off the hook, really. That you can say you give support to the statement, but you can't speak on behalf of all Catholics and support the yes vote to Parliament. That's again not a very simple, straightforward proposition. But where is the morality in this? Dare I say it? Where would Jesus stack up on that? And so. There's a uniting church up where I am in the Northern Rivers that's got its placards out and it's got a statement on the board. There's an Anglican church in Bangalore that's done the same. I haven't seen anything on any of the Catholic churches. I've got diverted again, Kathy. So.
I think that was a very worthy diversion. So
if it has to be, so it's ground up.
Yeah.
Ground up has got to be a very big part of it. The Yes 23 campaign has got its own social media approach. There are events like this that we're doing all over the place. I'm not actually a formal part of the Yes 23. I'm just doing this with Thomas mostly as a kind of add-on. But you can't underestimate the strength of the kitchen table conversation and the variations of it. You've only got to look to the Cathy McGowan model in Indi. Very conservative seat, right through its history. Cathy comes in, people, including young people, coming to her and saying, they're taking this for granted. They're just taking this for granted. And so out of that, Cathy McGowan takes the seat from them, and it's now in its fourth parliamentary term with an independent, because Cathy stood down after 2 terms and Helen Haynes took over. And that became the bedrock for the Teals. So much of the Teals' success was based on what was happening at the grassroots with the volunteers and so on. So, they were copying, they were getting a fair bit of national media as well, but most of the work that delivered those seats came from the grassroots. You think about family, you think about church family, you think about colleagues, you think about friends. And it's surprising the anecdotes that we have heard again and again and again. Oh, look, I bought your book and because I'm desperate for Dad to actually be challenged on this because he wants to vote no. And he read the book and he's changed his mind. Or they've just spoken to somebody and as a result of them, because they themselves felt confident enough, having taken the trouble to learn the picture enough to be able to have a conversation about it. People, there's a big soft centre in this, big soft centre of people who really don't know. So, but also look to, for instance, I think the mainstream media coverage has been abysmal. I think it's been deeply irresponsible, and I'm disgusted, really, with my own industry. But there are some shining lights. I think The Guardian's been terrific. The Guardian just the other day came out with it's taken the pamphlets, the yes dot points from the pamphlet, the AEC pamphlet, and the no dot points, and they've done a fact check. And my first reaction was, thank God. But then the second was, why is it taking you so long? Because the pamphlet's been available for weeks and weeks, and that's just one illustration. And there are others who've still done nothing. I don't think you'll find too much honest fact-checking about the no case in the Murdoch media. Trust yourselves and get that bloody word out, put pressure on them. When I look around the room, some of your more active colleagues who do have access to the pulpit, I don't know, I'd be fascinated to hear what real, and the laity, where is the driving force inside the Catholic Church? Do you find, a few people are convinced about this, do you feel good about that? I mean, and if you don't feel good about it, as you probably haven't felt good about any number of issues, it's in your hands to do your own personal something about it and together.
A true journalist asking the questions.